Chapter 9. Entry. Katsu and the Judge Masters have supreme authority over all matters in Ivalice, but the cities have remained constitutionally independent. Essentially, what this means is that the cities must muster troops for the army if Katsu demands it, they must pay whatever taxes he declares, and they must swear fealty to him in times of war. But once any Judge Master steps into one of the major cities or one of the smaller towns surrounding it, they are under its law. The main reason for this is that despite owning the largest fighting force Ivalice has ever seen, the cities are too well established as autonomous city-states. When he declared Cyril his base of operations, an odd agreement was formed. Katsu got a piece of land deemed outside of the city's jurisdiction, and he agreed to follow Cyril's laws when actually in Cyril. The agreement was likened to two people on opposite sides of a scale overlooking a really deep pit. If one person pushes the other off, they both go tumbling, so in the end, each party just pretends the other person doesn't exist. Sproum had its mighty army to support it, and Katsu had already suffered one defeat against St. Gregory's monks. Because of this, he wasn't wanting to make the Banga any more angry than normal. Muscadet, surrounded by the wild forests on one side and the silver mines on the other, was a tactician's nightmare. The new Mao of Kadun merely sent an emissary with a message saying they would very much appreciate it if Katsu never set foot in their city. Ever. Any Black Eagles stationed there never came back. It's currently the safest haven for political fugitives. But what of Baguba? It was nowhere near as strong as the other cities, had almost no protection, and only Sproum was closer to Cyril. Why couldn't Katsu take the Mughals' beloved city, and the mighty banks, factories, and coffers full of cash that came with it? Well, the fact was that Baguba had an army of its own. It was more powerful than any army before it, and all of the cities in Ivalice feared its might. It was an army of commerce. Its generals were bankers, its commandos were lawyers. Since all major holdings were sure to go through Baguba at least once, most all large private businesses needed Baguba to stay independent, or else Katsu would own them as well. Along with that, if at any time one of the larger Baguba banks decided to call in its debts, the entire country economy would crash. The banking firm of Winston & Winston was particularly powerful, and actually owns 2/3 of Baguba itself as collateral, considered the filet mignon of real estate. The Winstons, more humorous than you'd imagine 360-year-old bankers to be, have a large bronze plaque on the front of their building which reads, "You mess with us, you mess with your money. Kupo." It is no surprise that Katsu really hates the Winston family. End of entry. On a bank of the Ule River, something very interesting indeed was not happening. A small war pinnace-class airship and a larger royal sloop were not being dropped down under the cover of the morning fog. 40 soldiers in identical black uniforms and of varying race were not coming from different parts of the river and making their ways to the ships which also weren't there. They were not each wearing a steel cuirass, darkened by smoke purposefully so it wouldn't glint. They were not grimly sharpening swords, choosing rods, or twirling knives in preparation for a battle. And they were most definitely not all looking towards Karl, who had 2 cigarillos in his mouth, his entire face wreathed in smoke. It was quite amazing, all this stuff not happening in such detail. "You have been chosen for this mission specifically because you are the best, Kupo. You are our finest sailors." He nodded to a pair of black and white speckled Mughals. Their faces were obscured by a black scarf across their jaws, but their luminous yellow eyes flickered in acknowledgement and they gave him a quiet "Kupo, in return.
Our greatest fighters.
He looked towards a band of humans and Banga, each holding a great blade in one hand and a shield in the other.
And our keenest strategists, Kupo.
3 new Maos looked back at Carl with a benign look, as if they'd just noticed him.
Our mission is simple, Kupo. Our primary goal, which should be completed no matter the cost, is to find and capture this new Mao, Kupo.
With that, he held up a portrait of Roland.
He is to be captured alive and unscathed if possible, Kupo. You are also to capture this young Mughal, of the Winston family, Kupo.
He brought out a picture of Beth. There were a few wolf whistles from some of the Mughals.
Capture her alive as well. An untouched Kupo.
He growled.
The holy man must make it to Rhoda, but everyone else is expendable, Kupo. Understood? Yes, sir.
Came the reply automatically. These were the best, after all. There wasn't a doubt that they would accomplish the mission. Carl nodded.
Very well. The 25 that make up Cassandra's team head to the Ivy Lady. You are under her command. The other 15 will join me on the Storm Crow. Move out.
The Black Eagles broke away almost instantly. They tromped up the gangplanks. The ramps were retracted. The boilers were lit. The turbines were calibrated. One of the black speckled Mughals tied his black jacket around his waist, put on a pair of goggles and cracked his knuckles.
Fire up the superheaters, Kupo. Release main valve 2, Kupo.
He called in a barely audible whisper. The appropriate lever was pulled by a human, who had stripped down like his superior.
Let down the pressure in pipe 5. Stand by for takeoff.
Carl walked about the upper deck of his pinnace as the troops rushed around. He was accompanied by a new Mao carrying a blue rod and a large red Banga who wore a heavy hood and cloak instead of the normal black forage cap of the Black Eagles.
Lieutenant, send a semaphore to Cassandra saying we're ready to take off, Kupo.
The new Mao nodded and brought out an identical blue rod and went to the bow of the ship. He waved the 2 rods in a complex maneuver. It was answered by 2 green rods on the sloop's bow.
The message has been sent, Commander,
the lieutenant called.
The countdown has been initiated. 5 minutes to take off.
Carl waved at the lieutenant with his 2 cigarillos. He looked down to see that they were all but finished.
Colonel, you wouldn't happen to have any smokes on you, would you, Kupo?
The Banga offered the Mughal officer a cigar at least 7 inches long.
It's a Kaduan sage's suicide. My daughter got me a box of them for my birthday, but I'm trying to quit. Would you like them?
Carl took the massive roll of tobacco and sniffed it.
Very nice, Kupo. I'd appreciate that very much, actually. But what can you tell me about the ship Eric Winston currently has in port, Kupo?
The Banga nodded and brought out a piece of paper from under his cloak.
The Winstons have 2 heavy flights back from Cyril carrying cotton and 3 light merchantmen from Kaduan, the Kudik Peaks, and Rhoda, respectively. All paperwork for the Rhoda flight was filed 2 weeks in advance. They also have 4 of their smaller barks just coming back from various smaller towns. Shipping grain, I believe. It's a standard route for them.
Carl thought about this as he bit off one end of the giant cigar he was offered. Lighting it, he took a small puff like most cigar smokers take, and blew out the white smoke in a practiced ring.
Is that chocolate I taste, Kupo? I always wondered why the new Maos did that to their cigars.
He said, smiling. Then he started to think about the information the colonel had just given him.
Kupo, flights are too slow if they want to get over the border. The merchantmen are a bit quicker, and better defended Kupo, but no real match against a true military vessel. Trying to run a border in a bark is just suicide, Kupo. Do they have anything else, Kupo? Maybe Mr. Winston has a yacht or something.
The colonel brought out another piece of paper.
This is rather interesting, actually. We don't know if it's in port, it's practically a legend. 2 years ago, Mr. Winston had a new ship commissioned at the Rosen and Richards Shipwright Company. None of my port spies has ever seen it dock, and the project may have been scrapped, but if I was going to try to outrun the government, I'd do it in this.
Carl took a look at the paper. It was a schematic for a ship, but like a ship he had never seen before. His eyes popped out as they darted across the paper, taking in every detail of this new class of ship.
Kupo,
he said weakly.
When the Winstons want to build a blockade runner, they don't spare any expense, do they?
The Bangor colonel nodded.
It's an amazing craft, isn't it?
Carl stared at the schematics for a few moments longer.
Colonel, how long would it take to get something a bit more substantial, Kupo? Given top priority, I can get one of the lighter war brigs in about 2 hours.
Carl nodded and puffed on his cigar.
Mobilize one as soon as you can, Kupo. I appreciate your help very much, Colonel.
The Bangor nodded slightly.
This is quite an undertaking, Commander. Should you fail, you would have attacked a very prominent merchant's vessel without any warrant. Not even probable cause. You can't plead you were helping with the runaway case because you were given no authorization by Mayor Brinker. You know what would happen then, don't you? You know what the Black Eagles would have to do to you.
Carl looked about the deck of his ship, the cigar firmly clenched in his teeth.
I won't fail, Kupo. I requested the best, I got the best.
The Red Colonel looked at Carl and a mixture of pity and admiration flashed behind his hood.
For your sake, Commander Victorson, I hope you're right.
Joseph was completely catatonic. His eyes were glazed over. His mouth hung agape. There might have been some drool trickling down his jaw.
Ku.
He stuttered.
We never had craft like this in my day,
Roland said, also staring.
Ku. It's like a lightning bolt was transformed into an airship,
Matt said. Yes, he was staring as well. As a matter of fact, so were Arthur and Beth. The entire party was gaping at the airship before them. It was not the largest ship they had ever seen, it was much smaller than a small brigantine. It wasn't the most beautiful ship they had ever seen, its swirly nondescript grey paint and low-gloss finishing made it almost melt into the wall, and anything metal had been blackened to dull shining. But if you ever saw a ship that embodied speed, this would be it. The hull of the vessel was in a concave V shape. Its keel looked like it had been sharpened to cut through the clouds themselves. Its long, low-slung shape extended to the smokestacks, which dipped down and snaked across the stern. The bow was raked forward and came to a steel-tipped point. It looked like an arrow, ready to be fired from a bow.
Kupo,
Joseph finally managed. Eric stood beside them, serious pride on his face.
She's beautiful, isn't she, Kupo? I don't think I'd have asked if this ship can get us to Rhoda,
Arthur said in awe.
I'm more worried it would leave me behind. Uncle Eric, you really don't have to do this, Kupo. I'm serious.
Mr. Winston smiled at his niece and shook his head.
Oh, but I really do, Kupo. We Winstons can't have one of our own being taken by that famfrit blasted usurper Katsuo, Kupo. Your grandfather, my father, would writhe in his grave if that happened.
You could hear the enmity in his voice as he spoke of the Supreme Judge Master. Despite this, Arthur had to clarify something that had been nagging him since he had met Mr. Winston.
Mr. Winston. Pardon my asking, but I know that Isaac Winston's brothers created the banking firm Winston & Winston with a lot of the money and assets he got from questing. How many siblings did Isaac have? Just the 3 brothers, Kupo. And how many kids did Isaac have? 5, Kupo. All sons. And how many children did all of you have put together? 13. All sons as well, Kupo. Well, all except for our little treasure here,
he said, giving Beth a little hug.
Yeah, Kupo,
Beth said, but returned the hug anyway.
So when are we lifting off, Kupo? In 10 minutes. We need to go early, Kupo, while this storm front's blowing in from Sproum. The clouds will give the ship good cover, Kupo. Where are our quarters, Master Winston?
Roland asked.
My apprentice must bring in my luggage and he has studies he must attend to post-haste. Am I proofreading your notes again, Master? Shush. They are below decks, Roland. And I must say, it was a pleasure to meet you, Kupo. I had an excellent time talking to you about your adventuring days. Now you're sure that the stones you found in that cave in the Kutik Peaks were opals, Kupo? Sir, I am a sage. I study the primal forces of magic and nature. If I say the stones are opals, they are opals.
He said, twirling his tiny mustache in his slender fingers.
I think I'll stop by my uncle's firm and have a look at some of the deeds, Kupo. One of my younger sons just acquired a shield factory and those opals could help increase revenue. Well, I hope if you do find them, you'll be kind enough to make a small contribution to my studies. I may have some information you'd find lucrative. Of course, Kupo. Did you ever perfect that improved sleep spell? I have a warehouse of generic staves we could imbue with it. If we got them out before next Sage Moon, we could exhibit them at the trade show in Kowloon, Kupo. The bishops would go crazy for them, Kupo. I think that would be quite.
Roland stopped scheming to look at Matt.
Apprentice, what are you doing still sitting here? Go get my luggage, quickly now. Yes, Master,
Matt said, quickly trotting towards the Winston's coach.
Mr. Winston,
Arthur cut in.
I realize this ship relies on camouflage and speed for protection, so it's unsurprising it has no cannons or armor. But do you have anything in the off chance that we get ambushed?
Eric smiled.
Follow me to the foredeck of the ship, Arthur. I have something that may let you rest easy, Kupo.
Meanwhile, Joseph had wandered off and found himself in the boiler room. His little engineer mind was going haywire as he took in everything around him. Cogs clacked about, twirling endlessly. Pipes snaked in and out of the walls, bristling with gauges. In the middle of everything there was the boiler, a massive structure wrought from wood and black iron. Its great grated maw was open and black, not yet hungry. Soon though, it would demand to be fed.
Hey, it's one of the lubbers, Kupo,
came a rough voice behind him. A wiry old Mughal walked in. He was dressed up in the style of steam mechanics everywhere, with nothing on his chest but a tank top stained by oil and sweat, his pants rolled up to the knees. Said pants were held up by a large black belt stuffed with tools.
"This is a boil,
said his companion, a tall leggy Vieira stripped down in the same manner. She was enunciating each word as if she was talking to a simpleton. Airship crews had a tendency to be a bit condescending towards those who were tied to the ground.
"Do you know what a boil, does?" "It powers the engine on the second floor through steam cupo,"
Joseph said, not paying attention to them. Being a foreman at his age, he was used to people treating him like an idiot.
"Very good,"
she said with patronizing voice of encouragement.
"Now this is what we call a 350-gallon Baguba-style crushed anthracite-fueled boiler with a custom spiraled superheater and governor, cupo. Superheaters probably heated by gas, right?"
He looked at the two dumbfounded mechanics and savored a small smile before turning to the Vieira.
"You know, Vieira mechanics are rare and you look very familiar, cupo. Are you related Isabella Gardner?"
"She's my sister," she practically growled.
"Oh really? Small world, cupo. She works as one of the chief mechanics under me in my shaft."
The look on the Vieira's face when he said under got about 100 watts darker.
"She's a hard worker, cupo, and she's the only one who can work our 12-year-old mining engine. It's got an old iron chocobo-style single-piston engine. I'm always afraid the thing's going to blow up in our face, but she keeps it running smoothly. I feel better knowing her sister's handling the engine on this ship, cupo. What's your name?"
"Anastasia," she said, now actually growling. Joseph nodded.
"A pleasure, cupo. Well, I shouldn't get in you guys' way, right?"
With that, he walked out. The older Mughal grinned and nudged his partner.
"Well Annie, he certainly showed you, cupo. Just get the other engineers," she snapped.
Meanwhile, on the top, Arthur was given an introduction to the ship's defense system.
"These are gun skiffs, cupo,"
Eric explained.
"They're about the size of a large dinghy,"
Arthur said, marveling at the simplicity of the design. The skiffs were almost completely stripped down, with the tiniest scrap of armor on its hull.
"The engine looks pretty small, though."
Eric nodded.
"These things do more gliding than actual flying, cupo. See, they're meant to be really quick. You just fire the grapple gun into the hull."
He pointed to the large crossbow-like gun attached to the skiff's stern.
"Then you rake the deck with Gatling gun fire,"
he pointed to the crank-powered gun on the starboard.
"And board the ship, cupo. You don't exchange manly broadsides with a ship like this, cupo. Just get onto the ship and disable it from the inside. We have 3 of them on the ship. If you're in danger, they're launched off the hull to distract the ship, and the runner bolts. But for this to work, you'd need something like a team of Marines. People who do this kind of thing for a living."
Eric grinned and waved to the boarding ramp.
"That's exactly what I did, cupo. Got the best team money could buy. Arthur, meet Larson Brown and his group. They're better than any unit serving under Katsuo, cupo."
A huge human man with a beard that stirs up pictures great plagues and stone tablets winked at the two of them as he made his way across the deck.
"A pleasure to work with you again, Mr. Winston. Few of the other merchants see my crew's use in the cutthroat world of private commerce."
Arthur looked at Larson.
"Sir, we monks of St. Gregory observe the practice of privacy, but I never got the hang of it. So, just out of curiosity, are you a pirate?
Larsen grinned and gave a hearty laugh.
Oh ho, good father! You accuse me and my perfectly law-abiding crew of being thieving, murderous scalawags? We run a perfectly legitimate salvage business. With a Samson sword and a sawed-off slug thrower.
For you non-savvy types out there, a slug thrower is slang for a shotgun loaded not with the standard lead pellet shot, but instead a lead slug, about the size of your thumb. One shot could go through 3 guys, break through a door, and sunder the engine behind it.
Well, sometimes business gets slow and we need to make our own salvage, if you know what I mean,
Larsen said, grinning.
I'm just a bit surprised a holy man would know so much about weaponry. We St. Gregory monks also observe the practice of scholarship. You really latched onto that one, didn't ya?
Larsen asked, his eyebrows raised.
Well, if you'll excuse me, I'll be with the rest of the crew below decks until we're needed.
As Larsen walked off, Eric looked up at Arthur and patted his thigh. He couldn't reach his back, you see.
Don't worry, Kupo. I've met other traders and industrialists who make Larsen's crew look like a boys' choir. You'll be fine with them, Kupo.
Arthur looked down at Eric.
Mr. Winston, I sincerely hope so. You have done so much for us, I pray that it isn't for nothing.
Eric shook his head.
Arthur, I have spared every expense possible. It's the Winston way, Kupo. I know that it's been stressful, but now, it's in my hands. So don't worry.
Arthur smiled. Beth was weird, why would she want to distance herself from her family? If they were all like her uncle, he had never met a more caring group of people.
Thank you very much, Mr. Winston. For everything. Your home was the only place that I've felt comfortable in since I left the monastery. Those beds are the best money can buy, Kupo. Glad you liked them.
Arthur grinned.
Sir, I'm an ascetic monk. I normally sleep on a woven rush mat in a room half the size of your closet with a piece of rough wool covering me. And I have a roommate. What felt comfortable was the sense of caring that permeated your house. It was everywhere.
Eric, a fairly serious man all things considered, nodded and smiled a bit.
That's quite a compliment, Kupo. Well, Kupo, it's almost time for all of you to hop the border. See you in a few months.
With this, Eric Winston walked off the gangplank, and back to whatever scheming he had been letting cook for the past few days. Looking around, Arthur realized all the activity that had been going on around him. The rest of Larsen's crew was heading below decks, the ropes tying down the ship were being slung off, and the deep humming of the turbine starting up could be heard. Our young white monk decided he'd better go to his room and keep out of the way. Minutes later, this nameless ghost of a ship rose from the dock and into the dusky sky. It was almost as if it was never there. As Eric had said, he had spared no expense on the making of his blockade runner, and had outfitted it just as much as a private yacht as an escape ship. He couldn't put anything too heavy as it would affect its speed, so there wasn't a kitchen or a billiards table or anything like that, but he did put in a very nicely decorated lunch and fully stocked wet bar. Roland was enjoying a pleasant chocojito as his apprentice continued his ahem studies.
And you forgot to use a hyphen again when you wrote odd looking. Why do you insist on not using hyphens, master? Because they are both worthless and displeasing to the eye,
the sage said as he swirled his drink contemplatively.
A small, festering ink gash where a pleasant space should be, I say. Now continue.
Matt sighed and dipped his quill into the red ink pot again. Here's a new Mao who designs a new spell every other day, and yet he writes so quickly. He spelled ship as gip. How is that even possible? Nonetheless, he had been learning a lot under him.
It's done, master,
he said, giving this morning's stack of papers back.
So what's the lesson today? Patience, my eager apprentice, for I must finish my delicious drink.
Roland then proceeded to casually sip at the bright yellow cocktail for 10 minutes, with a few unintelligible hums and ahs of pleasure.
That was a very good drink, if I do say so myself. I like how that Eric fellow thinks. Terrible shame I never met his father. Yes, I know,
he said as he saw his apprentice's anxious face.
But first, a question. What is alchemy? A crutch for those who cannot work magic in its true natural form,
Matt said automatically. Roland, a dyed-in-the-wool sage, never did approve of alchemy, saying that all that fiddling about with the elixirs and elements and such wasn't proper magic.
Correct. Now how does it work? By breaking down available components into simple elements, and rearranging them for desired magical synergy. Precisely. And though it can never match the primal magic that I teach you for power, it does have its benefits. Observe.
With this, Roland took Matt's saber.
It isn't visible to the naked eye, but with a touch of magic properly placed,
Roland sent a gentle pulse of magic down the blade's hilt. It spread to the blade, and the outline of an odd symbol twisted into a perfect circle glowed blue.
There. A magic circle. Now, how does this particular piece of alchemy work? By twisting the natural magic within the circle so that it has a new effect on the environment. Good. These can do anything from reverse the flow of time within the circle or create a magical magnet that sucks in the power around it, making a very messy situation you'd better pray you never end up in. This particular one helps channel the specific frequencies of magic used to learn blue magic from beasts. Now for the fun part of the lesson.
Roland hiked up his kilt and hopped out of his chair. Taking one finger, he plunged it into his pipe. It came out blackened from the ash.
Making a magical circle is a surprisingly easy thing to learn, but you must be meticulous. First, you must make a perfect circle. Because this is ridiculously difficult, almost to the point of impossibility, we have these handy stencils.
Reaching into his kilt, he brought out 2 pieces of metal with a circle punched in the middle. Putting one down on the floor, he ran his sooty finger around the perimeter. He then put his finger in the middle and snaked some magical energy into the rim.
Your turn, apprentice.
Matt put his finger in the pipe ash and did the same with his stencil and circle.
Next, we need an aura amplifier. Something that will make the magic within the circle visible so we can work with it. There are a few, but I go in for powdered snake toenails. Where do you get that, master?
Matt asked, severely confused. I mean, snake toenails?
Oh, you can get a pot of the stuff for 20 gil by the ounce at any decent alchemy supply store. I never ask how they get it. Anyway.
With this, he threw some green powder into the circle. It dissipated after a second, and left a tangle of glowing blue string about as thick as a shoelace.
Now, you just shape the magic. Take a bit of your own, run it into your hands, and just coil and move it about into the desired shape. Now this one's pretty simple, so you can be a bit slapdash with it. Once you get into the higher end stuff, you'll probably want a grid, some mithril holding pins, some mithril tweezers, a compass and triangle, and so on. But really, this is about how complicated you want it to be. Anything else is just ridiculous.
Finished, he stepped back to observe his work. It looked like an hourglass with 3 lines going down it.
Now you give it a good slap, and you're ready to go. So, what does this particular circle do, master? Oh, deconstruction.
With that, he slapped his hand into the middle of the circle and a hole appeared in the floor. There was a scream and a rivet was shot up through the hole and got Roland in the middle of the forehead. The sage keeled over in a deliberate, dignified fashion, rather like a large tree. Matt swept away the circle encasing the spell, and the hole popped out of existence. Then he looked at his teacher. The rivet appeared to have done merely aesthetic damage to his head.
Master, are you okay? Quite fine, apprentice, quite fine. I was right about that Vieira machinist though. There was nothing fake about her. I still say she had some kind of cosmetic magic done on her. She seemed a bit too perky in various places. And did you open up a hole under the female changing room on purpose? Apprentice, I do everything for a purpose. Now go study the section in your basic magic book on magic circles. We will review later on.
Matt shook his head and picked up his things before trotting up the stairway to the main deck. As he finally stepped onto the surface of the ship, he was welcomed by violin music. Intrigued, Matt followed the music to the bow of the ship. Though technically morning, people tend to still be asleep at 4 o'clock in the am. As such, Joseph was beautifully silhouetted before the slightly orange-tinged cloud-crowded sky as he played his violin. This wasn't the jig they had played on the cart going towards Baguba. This was a music that tugged on your heartstrings and bruised your brain. This was music that made you smile and cry and think. Matt smiled as he walked behind his Mughal friend, deciding not to disturb him. He and Joseph had developed a friendship almost by necessity. They were the only 2 young men on the trip besides Arthur, who really didn't count being a monk and all. He found Rox comfortable for goodness sake. How do you talk to a guy like that about your problems? Joseph, meanwhile, wasn't thinking about anything at all. His mind was miles away, nothing but the music was allowed to enter it. His entire soul was being poured into that violin, and each time the bow was pulled against the strings, a tiny part of him drifted into the night sky. It was as if through the music, he was trying to fill the entire night with himself. The soft sound grew and grew with each passing moment of music, the notes melting together into bittersweet singing of the spirit. And then, as the song came to a close, Joseph retreated back into the tiny frame of his body.
Don't stop, Kupo!
Joseph snapped his head backwards to behold Beth, not in the black mage garb she had worn since the beginning of their adventure, but a purple sundress, cut at the calf. Her feet were bare, and he saw 2 golden anklets on them. She wore green eyeshadow that made her golden brown eyes shine out like 2 beacons. He felt his face warming as his world slowly lost focus and all he saw was Beth. Nothing seemed real but her lustrous black hair, her perfect soft lips, her beautifully voluptuous figure. She was the only thing in his existence. He didn't attempt to say anything as he knew he wouldn't be able to make words with his tied tongue.
You play so beautifully, Kupo,
she said as she walked to his side.
Aren't you cold, Kupo?
He finally managed to stutter. He himself was wearing a grey jack coat and scarf to combat the cold. Not that he was complaining, of course, but,
Kupo, did I actually think that?
He thought to himself, surprised and appalled at his own brain. Beth didn't seem to notice his exchange with himself, for she just smiled and took one of his hands and put it on her waist. Oh my!
I'm warming myself up with magic, Kupo. See? I was always good with fire at the academy.
Indeed, Joseph was warming up, as much by his prize-winning blush as by Beth's spell and proximity, which was really, really close.
Here, Kupo. Let's warm you up.
She sat herself in Joseph's lap and wrapped his arms around her.
Ah!
Was all Joseph managed to get his tortured voice box to say. This was too much. Running blockades, escaping judges, aggressively beautiful women. Oh, he would give anything to be back in Muscadet. The shaft was looking promising, and he'd just gotten approved for the new budget. They'd be sinking the new edition in about now and...
Wait a minute, Kupo, who are you kidding?
Came that renegade voice in his head again.
Here is a girl who's smart, nice, funny, and drop-dead gorgeous, and you're thinking of mining Kupo. What's wrong with you? But this isn't me, Kupo.
Said the other part.
I am boring, I'm terribly scared of beautiful women, and I like mining, Kupo. As much as you like Beth, Kupo. Well, No thinking.
The voice yelled.
Would you give up your job if it allowed you to stay with Beth for the rest of your life, Kupo? Boom. Stop thinking.
The voice bellowed, pressing the offensive.
Yes or no, Kupo? Yes.
He yelled. Like actually yelled. He was no longer in the realm of his own brain. Beth heard him pretty clearly.
What was that a yes to, Kupo?
She said slowly. Joseph stared at her. Well, it couldn't get any more awkward, could it? The deviant voice had won out, so he leaned forward and planted a kiss on Beth's perfectly luscious lips. Ha ha. No, just kidding. We can't let him get off that easy, after all. The poor fellow bumped Beth's nose with his, and there was a slight pain shared by both of them, followed by a little rub of the nose.
Sorry, Kupo. Oh, Kupo, I'm sorry.
Joseph was blushing so brightly his face was about the same hue as his hair. Beth giggled a bit.
Thank fem for it, Kupo,
she said to herself.
I was starting to get afraid he wasn't into me. Ah, he's so cute though.
With that thought, she put one hand behind his head, and guided Joseph's mouth towards hers. Now this was a kiss. This was a kiss worthy of Gone with the Wind or Casablanca. It was a kiss that could go on for centuries, the kind of kiss that made fireworks go off. Which is why the cannon shell that blew up right beside them was all the more ridiculous. The shot cannonied them both to the side, Joseph landing on top of Beth. Normally, the deviant voice in his head would be telling him to make the most of this, but it was joining the rest of his brain in screaming about whatever the heck was lodged into his chest. Beth cried out when she saw the piece of the deck that had been thrown into Joseph's chest.
Joseph, are you still there, Kupo?
She said, nerves choking her voice.
That was amazing, Kupo,
he whispered. A trickle of blood was coming from his mouth.
Oh Famfrit, you're bleeding internally. No, Kupo. Don't die. Don't die, Joseph.
She was crying now. Giant tears were running down her cheeks and dripping off her whiskers.
He won't, mistress,
came a deep voice behind her. Looking up, she saw the great form of Larson Brown, his face solemn.
They'll pay for this, I promise. Jack! Get the Mughal down to the sage. And hurry! We're launching the skiffs.
Jolly Jack, a monstrous tattooed Banga, carefully scooped up Joseph. Then he picked up Beth in his free hand and carefully sprinted towards the stairwell. Shells were whistling from the sky, but most of them were falling short. The ship was too fast to get a handle on. Still though, one or two managed to find a target and made the race there a bit more difficult. Jack bounded down the stairs 3 at a time, and burst through the door to the lounge. Roland was sitting at the bar, nursing a red, orange, and green drink in what looked like a wine glass that was slightly smaller than a punch bowl.
"Oh, has the fun started already?"
he asked, not looking towards them. Roland had been in many bombardments before, and he found the best thing to do were to ignore them. One way or another, they would pass. Whether you did as well was a mere formality. Jack carefully placed Joseph on the floor and Beth beside him.
"This Mughal is dying, Mr. Roland."
Having completed his task, he ran back up the stairs. At the sound of Jack's sentence, Roland's sleepy eyes snapped open. He hopped off of his stool and looked at Joseph. All color had drained out of his face. His grayish-blue eyes were dilated and his entire body was shaking in uncontrollable spasms.
"He's going into shock. Beth, I need you to go get Matt."
Beth had almost completely broken down, and was sobbing uncontrollably.
"Beth, you must get Matt. Get Matt, Beth. Beth, get Matt."
The last time he said that, Roland's voice had an otherworldly authority to it. Beth finally got up and ran to the stairwell. Meanwhile, Roland said a few soothing words and touched Joseph's face. He stopped shaking, and his erratic breathing became deep and regular.
"Sleep now, my young friend. For truly, you have one hell of a day ahead of you."
200 feet above, the bombardment was continuing on a royal sloop painted all black. Cassandra looked on with a new Mao in the Black Eagle garb. Her companion had his eyes shut and his hands out as if he was feeling for something.
"They are about 100 feet from point-blank range," he said.
Cassandra looked the way that the new Mao's arms were stretched.
"Send the message to Carl to make the drop," she called to a human with 2 glowing green rods in her hands. The human gestured with them, and got an answering flash back through the thick clouds from Carl's ship. "Drop initialized, Captain," the human said.
Cassandra nodded. She wasn't one for such things as talking or even expressions, but she did allow herself a small smile of satisfaction. Her commander was a very impulsive person, but he always seemed to know what he was doing. Just so long as the boarding went on without a hitch, it would have been like the Black Eagles were never there, the way they try to leave anywhere they've been to.
"Captain, I'm starting to pick something up,"
the new Mao beside her said. His hands swung around as if they had locked onto something.
"It's very small, but too big to be a bird. It might be a renegade weather balloon or something."
Cassandra narrowed her eyes. Weather balloons were known to come undone and drift off, but she wasn't one to trust odds.
"Bring up the troops. I have a bad feeling about."
Just before she could finish her foreshadowing, a quick staccato sound blasted down, as bullets sprayed. Tracers lit up the deck as they ripped into the light armored plating of the hull. Cassandra and the 2 officers with her dropped to the floor and crawled to the door into the sloop's cabin. In there were the other troops not working on the engines or at the helm. There were 16 in all, mainly Vieira. They had been equipped with a carbine and bayonet, which they had fixed to their gun's nozzle. They were all up against the walls and crouched under the windows as bullets flew through the broken openings. The machine gun fire finally died down and Cassandra issued orders.
Load weapons and form a defensive perimeter around this room. Don't shoot until my mark. Now move.
All of a sudden a judge appeared, shining armor and all.
This is a conflict between Cassandra Thespa and Larson Brown. Color magic and instruments are forbidden.
The Black Eagles, ignoring their much more shiny companion, moved like ghosts. They swiftly crouched in front of the windows, raising their guns to eye level.
Wait for them to make their move, she said.
On top of the roof, Larson listened and stroked his beard.
Make a move, eh? Well, let's see if I can cook up a good gambit.
6 other men were with him. Larson's group ran the gamut from Jolly Jack to a fellow who looked like Buzzard carrying 2 boarding axes. There were guns, swords, axes, a spear, and one fellow who was just hefting an exceptionally large club. They were a stark contrast from their adversaries, who looked as unidentifiable and uniform as ants. By contrast, Larson's crew were as oddly pieced together as a suit of 30-year-old chainmail that was knitted by an 80-year blind man who with an allergy to metal. The only thing they all seemed to share was a smile. They truly enjoyed this stuff.
Garrity has the other 6 in the second skiff circling the ship,
the Buzzard man whispered.
They'll drop down as soon as they hear the blast.
Larson nodded and grinned.
Well then, fetch my hammer so that I may do the honors.
Accepting a long-handled hammer from a new Mao who had a giant pack on his back, he hefted it and looked at the roof under them. With practiced ease, Larson brought the hammer down with all his might. The brittle tar-soaked wood splintered and the thin wooden shingles burst, leaving a man-sized hole in the roof. 2 smoking black canisters were quickly thrown down the hole as gunfire ripped through the roof. Larson's crew danced around on the roof as bullets zipped by. A Mughal caught a bullet through his left arm and made an impromptu sling with the sleeve of his jacket.
You all right, Jim?
The Pak Nu Mao said as he passed the Mughal a potion. Drinking it, Jim grinned.
It's just a part of my collection now, Kupo. I got 2 more floating about in me.
The firing of guns was cut short as the grenades finally detonated. The interior of the cabin was lit up by a flash whose intensity was only matched by the teeth-shattering screech that accompanied it. 4 of the Vieira who were practically on top of the grenades fell unconscious after they went off. Everyone else was more than slightly dazed.
Right, everyone,
Larson bellowed.
Into the breach.
Each crew member stomped down on the weakened roof, causing it to cave in. A few of the Black Eagles inside had come to their senses, and fired their weapons into the horde. 2 went down with holes in their heads. This didn't stop the rest from diving into the Black Eagles. The Buzzard man whirled about like a bladed tornado, his axes swinging wildly. One Vieira attempted to lance him with her bayonet, only to have her stock chopped in half and a foot driven into her stomach. The other axe hacked through another Vieira's wrist who was attempting to reload. Jolly Jack held 2 eagles in each hand and slammed all 4 into the wall. The wounded Mughal was standing beside the new Mao with the backpack, and each were emptying revolvers into any soldier who moved. The crew kept pushing the offensive, until only Cassandra and 3 Black Eagles remained standing. Larson, his Samson sword gleaming red, grinned at Cassandra.
Well miss, care to just concede?
The Black Eagle captain looked. Her troops had been devastated. She saw severed hands and legs, broken bones, head wounds, and worse. She wasn't going to let this go on any longer. She nodded.
The engagement goes to Lars Brown.
The judge bellowed.
But I must now place you under arrest for Sonny Jim,
Larson said, leveling his slug thrower at the judge.
How about you go and sit in that little corner there for now,
As Larson tied up the judge, a few of his crew members started administering to individuals from both sides. The crippled Mughal passed out potions, followed by the new Mao who pulled gauze and splints from his pack. He carefully cleaned, dressed, and set everything from removed fingers to severe puncture wounds. Finally, the buzzard man laid hands on some of the more serious cases and white magic flowed into their bodies. After that, the other crew members tied all the Black Eagle troops up as a formality. Can't be too careful, after all. Finally satisfied with his handiwork, Larson turned towards Cassandra, now bound at her wrists and ankles.
Well, I reckon you're done for, so we'll probably just take you all to Baguba. No doubt, Kaz'll take care of you from there. So, enjoy these few hours of freedom, pretty ladies. They'll most likely be your last, no matter what happens to you. Sorry.
Cassandra decided it would be best not to tell Larson about the boarding party currently latched onto their main ship. As long as Carl got the targets, there was still hope for her squad. As all this craziness was going on, Roland was getting his hands dirty 100 feet below.
This is bad business, apprentice. But let's get started. Have you memorized the channeling circle?
Matt nodded.
It was fairly simple, master.
Roland nodded and gave his apprentice a small stencil, a mirror, and some powdered snake toenails.
Here's your review. Put one on your head, quickly.
Dipping his finger into his inkwell, Matt traced the circle and started the spell.
Bloody alchemy,
Roland said as he got down onto the floor. He quickly slapped together 4 identical circles in a square around Joseph and drew lines of magic into each. Within the square, the light stayed exactly the same as it flickered around the rest of the room. He then made a channeling circle on the tip of his snout. Tapping it, the circle started to glow. Looking at his apprentice, he was happy to see he had quite proficiently shaped a channeling circle.
Quite a quick learner you are, apprentice.
With that, he tapped the circle on Matt's head.
Now I need you to feed magic into me as I go into the square. It'll keep me moving as I operate on Joseph.
Matt nodded and closed his eyes in concentration. Roland felt the warmth of Matt's magic coursing through his body and strode into the square. Joseph was now completely still, every bodily function frozen in place. Sighing, he got down to the fun part. Tracing yet another circle with his sooty finger, he snaked his power into it. Instead of making a magic circle, it made a small pocket independent of the effects of the 4 magic circles around it. The giant splinter of wood and the flesh around it were now workable.
Quickly, quickly,
Roland muttered as he continually worked magic into the wound with one hand while guiding the splinter out with the other. This was a particularly dire situation, because he had to not only regenerate the flesh around the wound, keep one lung working while punctured, and keep numerous arteries from gushing, but he also had to imbue the blood in the circle with oxygen since the brain was currently stuck 7 minutes in the past. Of course, if this was 90+ years ago, he would have been able to pull the magic necessary to take the stupid thing out and heal the entire ensemble straight from the ether itself.
Blast it, the sooner I get back to my former power, the better. This is more alchemy than I'd care to use in all my life. There, it's done.
Wiping the sweat from his brow, he got up and smudged away part of the square. With the structure broken, the spell collapsed and Joseph returned to sleeping restfully.
Keep running white magic into him for a few hours, apprentice. He'll need it to heal up the internal wounds. I am getting a drink. A strong drink. You deserve it, master,
Matt said as he started to charge up his buddy.
You'll be fine, Joseph. Thanks to master, you'll be just fine.
Roland, not bothering to mix a drink, swiped a bottle of Eric's rye off the bar and headed upstairs. Taking a mighty swig of it, he sauntered up to the deck and took out his pipe, which still pretty full. Patting around in his kilt, he realized he had no matches.
Blast, I'd better go back down then. Don't move, Roland Nikolai, Kupo.
Turning back to the deck, Roland found 10 fellows menacing him with blades and guns. Carl was at the forefront, with a high-caliber military rifle pointed directly at the sage.
Ah, very nice. Do any of you happen to have a light?
Before they could answer that, Roland sent a cyclone into their midst. It picked up 5 of them and slammed them into each other. Taking advantage of the surprise, Roland pulled out his mace and bashed Carl in the side of his head. Another judge appeared on the deck.
This is a conflict between Roland Nikolai and Carl Victorson. Items and spears are forbidden. Do spirits count as items?
Roland called as he dodged the slashing blades of Carl's party. While Cassandra's was almost exclusively Vieira, Carl had a band of humans and Banga, each with a long straight blade and buckler. They seemed to be more proficient at close quarters combat, and Roland's beautiful kilt was being sliced to ribbons.
No.
The judge bellowed.
Oh good then.
With that, Roland spun around and smashed the remaining booze over the head of a Banga that had been catching up. Another Banga leapt over his companion and drove his clawed foot into Roland's chest. It was a good solid hit, and the sage was knocked to other side of the deck. Carl, finally sorting himself out after Roland's savage first attack, brought his gun up and towards the sage's form. His 10 subordinates, all of which were still standing, formed a loose semicircle around him.
Mr. Nikolai, this is your final warning, Kupo. We're to take drastic measures after this.
Roland smiled slightly as he heaved himself up.
More drastic than setting 10 fine young lads after one old sage like me? I think I'll resist just to see what you have in store for me.
At that, each of the 10 troops sheathed their swords and brought out a noose. Roland raised his eyebrows. It's always good to know you're important enough to be wanted alive.
Well then let's get this over with.
Carl pulled the trigger on his gun.
Kupo, that was gunfire.
Beth exclaimed. She was with Arthur, who had been comforting her ever since she got Matt. It was something he knew how to do, as he couldn't count the times he had stayed up with loved ones as their friends and family members began their drift through the abyss. The main difference, as he pointed out to Beth, was that they hadn't had a 120-year-old sage magic conduit tending to them. This had helped Beth tremendously, and the two had spent the past 10 minutes talking and laughing as if nothing was going on. The gunshot had brought them both back though.
Sounds like there's some trouble on the foredeck,
Arthur said, quickly getting up and sliding his knuckles on. Beth, now completely over her bout of hysteria, leapt off of her bed and grabbed a fire-wheel rod she'd stuffed under the mattress.
So there's no chance of you staying here where it's safe, is there?
Arthur asked in a tone of voice that already knew the answer.
Not even the smallest, Kupo. Now come on.
The two crept out of their quarters and peered around the door. 10 nooses had been wrapped around Roland, who was struggling against the 10 soldiers holding the ropes.
"They've got Roland,"
Arthur whispered.
"I can see that, Kupo,"
Beth whispered back.
"So what do we do?"
Arthur thought quickly.
"Go get Matt. I'll try to cut Roland loose."
Beth scurried down the steps to the bar, where Matt was enjoying a relaxing half-pint. His patient, still on the floor, was nursing a bottle of Firebird.
"It's strictly for medicinal purposes, Kupo,"
Joseph said with a grin.
"Matt says I'm going to pull through just fine, Kupo."
Relief washed over Beth's face and she smiled brightly.
"I don't know what I'd do if it turned out any other way, Kupo. But Matt, Arthur, and Roland need you up on the deck. A bunch of soldiers have your master, Kupo."
Matt instantly got up and drew his saber. He and Beth ran up the stairs, leaving Joseph on the floor, bewildered and a bit upset.
"They didn't even bother to say not to follow them, Kupo."
Trying to shift to his side, a wonderful white-hot pain blossomed in his chest.
"Okay,"
he gasped.
"Maybe they didn't need to, Kupo."
About 10 feet above our convalescing friend, Arthur was having trouble against Roland's assailants. He'd fought monsters before while clearing ground for the monastery's gardens, and they were tough and cunning. He'd fought the judges that had gotten in his way, but his no-nonsense style was more than a match for them. These soldiers though? They were tougher than any panther he'd faced, and knew more underhanded tricks than he did. Looking to find an opening, Arthur blocked a sword swing at his head and flipped his opponent over his shoulder and into another black-garbed fellow behind him. Finally seeing an opening, he launched a kick at a man's chest. The man caught Arthur's leg and pushed him away, leaving Arthur tottering backwards on one leg. One soldier behind him drew back his buckler and slugged him in the spine. Arthur collapsed and the grim Mughal leader rolled him over with the toe of his boot.
"Mr. Macfust Kupo, we had no quarrel with you. Now though, I'm going to have to arrest you as well."
As he reached to heave up Arthur, 2 fireballs burst onto the scene. The smaller one got Carl in the side and knocked him to the ground. The larger one hit the ground that had previously been soaked by Roland's bottle. Normally, this wouldn't be problem, but the rye distilled by Eric Winston is more akin to jet fuel than to, say, a bottle of Mount Vernon. The deck burst into flames, knocking everyone aboard onto their backs. The towering inferno snaked up to the heavens, leaving Carl, Arthur, and the eagles unconscious. Roland got up though, and dusted off his kilt, which had started to glow.
"The match goes to Roland Nikolai. But I must now place you under arrest for..."
Roland took out an anti-law card and froze the judge in mid-sentence before pushing his motionless body off the airship. Dusting himself off, he nodded towards his 2 young saviors.
"That was an excellent use of the Fira spell, young Bethany." "Thanks, Kupo. Are you okay? You were pretty much at the center of it, Kupo." "Ah, this old kilt can withstand anything. Yet another reason why alchemy is a necessary evil. At any rate, my young Mughal,"
he said to Carl's stationary body,
"we seem to have won. We'll just dump you and your thugs across the border when we get to Rhoda." "Fair enough."
Carl's unconscious body displayed a perfectly neutral view of the circumstances.
"Very good. Now then, apprentice."
2 large grappling hooks bit into the ship's deck.
"Stand still for a moment, would you?"
Roland finished.
What for, master? This.
Roland thwacked Matthew quite soundly across the head. He fell to the ground, and he dragged his apprentice towards Arthur's body.
This is really starting to get ridiculous. One reversal, then another, then another. I swear if Joseph comes limping out after his surgery to put in his own dose of Deus Ex Machina, I will be annoyed.
Then suddenly, the ship's speed drastically decreased and Roland was flung to the ground. Again.
Well, that was slightly annoying also. Roland Nikolai, Bethany Winston, turn around and do not move,
came an order from behind him. Looking backwards, he saw a rather larger black ship hanging onto the Winston's runner by grappling hooks.
Troops are coming in to arrest and detain you.
Beth paled at the sight of the ship. Roland could sense another breakdown coming.
Roland Kupo, help! I can't go with them. I'm at Winston. If they get me, they'll use me as a bargaining chip with my family. They'll be powerless. Do something, Kupo.
Roland took Beth's shoulder and drew her close. Her shivering stopped as she felt a soothing sensation go through her body at the sage's touch.
Bethany, do not worry. I have been able to surmise how important you are to these people. But rest assured, as long as you're in my care, no harm will come to you.
He then looked down into her eyes.
I do need you though. Will you come with me?
Beth looked up at Roland. Slowly, she nodded.
I trust you, Kupo.
Roland looked backwards.
Good. Because our valet has just arrived.
It was at this point that Roland was hit in the face with the butt of a gun. There are some parts that are best left out of a story. The time that Arthur, Matt, and Joseph spent in Rhoda is one of those. It would not be worth it to describe the job they did digging amongst the catacombs under the great cathedral. It would be best if we didn't talk about Arthur burying himself deeper and deeper into his work to forget his lost friend. It would be equally as good to glean over the depression Joseph was thrown into, not eating, barely sleeping, slowly becoming more and more like a shade than the healthy Mughal he was. Only Matt seemed to take the loss of his master well, but it would just be best to look the other way about the whole ordeal. Suffice it to say that the mission was completed, and there was not much good feeling at all. However, this tale can be ended with this scene, one that took place at the very end of this journey. A simple conversation over drinks in a little pub.
Here you go, boys,
Leonard said, bringing 3 mugs to the sober group taking up one corner of the bitter old bug.
This is it for the night. Make them last, eh?
Matt put down the gill for the drinks and nodded at the Bangor barkeep.
Our thanks, Leonard.
The 3 stared at the tankards. They drank from them. They stared again. Finally, Matt turned to Arthur.
So, what are you going to do now? I'm going back to the monastery,
he said.
You? Kaduan. Master gave me pretty detailed instructions if this was to happen. I'm going to, Kupo,
Joseph mumbled.
I'm going to find Beth. What about your job?
Arthur asked.
He
said, taking a deep breath.
I quit. After all I've done, my family wouldn't take me back anyway, Kupo. Now the only thing that matters is getting Beth back.
The 3 looked at their tankards again. They took another drink, and went back to staring.
I don't know if we'll meet each other again,
Arthur said.
But, When you do find Beth, come over to the monastery and say hi. I'd like to see her again.
Joseph nodded. When he spoke, there was an iron resolve in his voice.
We will, Kupo.
Leonard walked over to the three.
Bars closed, lads. It was good seeing you all again.
Arthur got up.
Well, I guess this is goodbye,
he said to the others.
I guess so, Kupo,
Joseph said. There wasn't any handshaking or hugging in this goodbye, just the overwhelming urge to get it over with. Each wanted to go, to just put this entire time behind them. All the pain, all the discomfort, the friends and opportunities lost. They all walked out of the bug, and into the cold, dark, snow-swept night of Sproum.